Hi everyone, welcome to episode 84 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. My guest for this episode is James Cameron. James was the former vice president at Accel, one of the world's leading early-stage venture capital funds, counting companies such as Facebook, Slack, and Atlassian as part of its portfolio. About 12 months ago, James moved back to Australia to join as a partner at Airtree Ventures, one of the leading venture capital funds in Australia, which also counts companies such as Canva, Prospa and HyperAnna in its portfolio. We covered a range of topics in this interview, including the two things that the best founders obsess over, selling through storytelling, and the process to hiring an effective VP of sales. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Hi James, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
No, thank you. It's an honour to be here. I think you've got a great podcast, and I'm a big listener. Yeah, in fact it's kind of weird hearing you in real time. Usually the podcasts that I listen to are sort of set to 1.5 or 2 times speed. So yeah. So I apologise if it throws me off a bit.
No, not at all. Well, I actually have spent the whole morning just listening to your previous podcast interviews with 20-Minute VC as well. So this will be interesting. But James, for anyone that isn't as aware of your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a partner at Airtree Ventures, which is a venture fund up in Sydney, and it's been a long journey, sort of getting to the point where I became a VC originally. And I think, I'm sure everyone who comes on this show says the same thing about how they sort of accidentally fell into VC, and I didn't break the mold in that respect. It's not something that I even knew about setting out from high school or university or anything like that. So I grew up in Canberra, came up to Sydney for university and did computer science and law there, and which is sort of a weird combo, but it made sense for me at the time. And I think as soon as I graduated, I pretty much nicked off overseas. I think it's something to do with growing up in Canberra and being so far away from everything, and feeling like you're completely outside of what's going on overseas. You really want to head off over there. And so my first stop was London, and I was a lawyer for a while. I worked at one of the big law firms there doing sort of M&A and corporate stuff for the big tech companies. And back at the time it was party gaming and Betfair and a lot of the US companies sort of moving into Europe and building out practices there like Google and the like. But I realized pretty quickly that I was a pretty shithouse lawyer. And so from that, I tried my hand at tech banking for a while, realized I wasn't very good at that either. And so then really I spent the next couple of years trying to find my way back into my first love, which was technology. And I think, computer science had moved on substantially from where I was studying at undergrad, and I was never much of a developer, to be honest, anyway. So I thought I'd, try and focus on the business of technology. And so I took myself off to the Valley because I thought that would be a great place to start. And I did a couple of years at the business school at Stanford, and it was there that I wound up finding my way into the world of startups. I started a company there, a fintech company, selling into research management software into hedge funds and mutual funds and people like that. And I ran that for a couple of years. It's still going now. It's called BipSync. And first came across sort of this wonderful world of VC when I was out pitching for this company. In fact, one of the very first pitch meetings I had with a fund in the US called Accel Partners. And it was a terrible pitch, to be honest. I mean, they were very polite not to laugh at me. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was way too early stage for what they look at. And they were very, politely sort of showed me the door and said, thanks very much for coming, but it's not for us. But I got to know the guys quite well out of that. They were kind enough to make a bunch of introductions. They ended up introducing us to the people that did fund us at a seed stage and then at Series A after that. And so got to become quite good friends with a bunch of them. And then when it was probably about 5 or 6 years after that, we were coming back to the UK. My wife and I decided to move back to London, which is where she's from. And they introduced me to the Accel team in London. And they said, why don't you come and see what it's like on this side of the table rather than pitching us your businesses. So I had really no idea what the day-to-day life for a VC was, but it sounded pretty interesting. So I was been there for the last 4 or 5 years, and then wound up coming back to Australia about this time last year. I'd gotten to know the Airtree guys quite well. We had a co-investment with Airtree at Excel, and so I'd gotten to know Daniel and Craig and the team there, and started thinking about coming back to Australia and working in VC, and there was a good opportunity to come back and really get involved in some of the much earlier stage stuff that we were looking at here at Airtree. And so that really prompted me to come back, and so I've been back for about a year now after 15 years overseas, and it's great to be back.
Yeah, wow. So obviously, an incredible career that you've had to date. Just something that I personally want to go back to. So I think we reconnected. We connected and chatted recently, and we found out that we actually went to the same high school back in Canberra. So obviously for me as well, I've got a lot of friends who kind of grew up with that similar sort of thing. It's just been really interesting to see the approach and the trajectory that everyone took from being in Canberra. And I think there was, you could almost filter people out into the two settings, which is one was Canberra's an amazing place, it's so comfortable and safe and nice, and I'm going to stay here and build a life here. And another one was Canberra's really safe and nice, I need to
and you react to that, right? And I think you do. You react to the sort of environment, and the good thing about Canberra, people give it a lot of shit, and rightly so. And when I was 17, all I could think of was getting the hell out of there. But at the same time, it's a very liberal, it's a very international focused city. I mean, there are diplomats everywhere. It is the seat of government, so you are sort of thinking and looking outside. And I think that prompts a lot of people to sort of go out and actually want to get involved in that outside. And so, I think it's the same thing. I think a lot of people that I went to school with had exactly the same experience I did, nicked off as soon as they could overseas. And I go back there now, and I go and talk to a lot of startups now. There's some really interesting stuff going on in Canberra. It's small but vibrant, and it's great to see that I can go back and I'd love to back the next great startup coming out of Canberra.
Absolutely. So I guess kind of moving forward a little bit, and so you mentioned you got into the startup space after spending a couple of years in law. What was that transition like for you, and what was that, if you want to tell us a little bit more about the idea and how you sort of built that up?
Yeah, so I didn't spend a lot of time as a lawyer because, as I said, I wasn't very good about it. I don't for a second regret being a lawyer, because I wound up meeting my wife, who is still a lawyer, much better lawyer than I ever was. So I got obviously a lot out of that. But really, the desire for me was to get back into building some form of technology, or some I'd be involved in what I thought was where the world was going, which at the end of the day is innovation and technology. And so that brought me back to the concepts, and then really finding my feet as a founder was all about speaking to a lot of people in the Valley, understanding the cut and thrust of early stage startup activity, how to go about building it, how to go about finding co-founders, how to go about finding technical co-founders in particular, and then finding a problem that was large enough and universal enough to really go after. And so that's why we had a lot of people that I'd spoken to based in New York who were working in hedge funds, in mutual funds, in broader investment management industry. And it kept coming back to this issue of how to find the right research management toolkit, how to pipe in the right quantitative data, how to record your own qualitative thoughts about potential investments, and really have a toolkit that sort of was with you everywhere, from your iPad to your desktop to your phone, and keep it all in one place. And that was a problem we wound up going after.
So I interviewed Craig Blair recently from Airtree. And one of the things that we were talking about was not really sort of understanding the investment process, or what goes on for an Airtree, for example, when they decide to move the startup through the different stages to a term sheet. I guess one of the other things that you kind of mentioned as part of the intro was that you pitched to Excel without really having something that was quite ready, and you were too early, but you still use that to form a relationship. And I think that's often something that gets overlooked in that discussion, is just because someone turns your way doesn't mean that that's kind of the end of the story. So again, can you talk a little bit about what that process was like, and even just that experience of pitching to Excel, and how did you sort of build and foster that relationship with them? Yeah, for sure.
And it probably helps to jump up a level and sort of talk about what we do at Airtree and at Excel. And I think that it's at the end of the day, it's pretty simple, right? We are looking for exceptional founders who either are or have the building blocks to become truly world-class entrepreneurs. And then really we do everything we can to help them build large, sustainable, category-defining companies. And when you put it like that, it seems simple, but it's really actually very complicated, obviously. And really, we aim to try and invest as early as we can. You know, we pride ourselves on being able to have enough capital and enough of the expertise internally and within our network to help founders all the way through, from seed, first check, all the way through to growth. And it's important for us to be able to do that. And you know, we've invested multiple times in companies that are, you know, pre-revenue, pre-product even. In fact, we've done recently one where, you know, the company didn't even exist. In fact, we had to wait for the incorporation documents for the company to come back just so that we could sign the term sheet. So we love being that first check and getting in very early. And really that's because it's all about finding fantastic founders who have that potential to build. You know, these companies don't come out of nowhere and are sort of born overnight into fantastic category-defining companies. They're built, and identifying founders from a very early stage and getting to know them and really trying to understand what is unique about this founder is incredibly important. So having those conversations with the VC early on, I think puts you at a huge advantage when you're later on down the track and you've got a good idea and you're starting to think about actually forming a company. Having a network of people that you've spoken to is incredibly important. You know, at the end of the day, we're looking for outliers. Right? This is why our job, you know, can be quite difficult, is because by definition there's no stereotype to the founders we're looking for. Great founders just don't have stereotypes. They're outliers on some dimension, be it ambition or technical expertise or resilience or hustle. Oftentimes they're, you know, outliers on multiple dimensions. And to find those sort of founders, it's incredibly difficult because there's no single mold. And so getting to know someone on a very personal level and really understanding what their superpowers are, for us, is the most critical part of the entire investment thesis. So getting to know these people very early on is incredibly important.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's no set stereotype. So what is it specifically that you're looking for, and how do you test that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's no stereotype. It's hard to figure out what to look for. But I guess there's, you know, if I had to sort of pull out some strings that go across all of our, you know, the most exciting founders that we've ever backed, I think there is always a sense of real product obsession, product and customer obsession. I think when we look across founders like Mel and Cliff at Canva and Natalie at HyperAnna and Tim at 90 Seconds, these founders are all completely obsessed with the way their clients and their customers view the problem that they're solving. You know, they don't just sort of spend time thinking about, you know, spend time in their customers' shoes. They literally live in those customers' shoes, and they're completely obsessed about solving those problems. And the reason we like that is because, you know, we have a firm view internally that the best product wins. Not always. You know, there's you know, you can have a fantastic product and still screw up the execution, don't get me wrong. But if you really are focused on nailing the best product experience for your customers and solving it in a way that is 10x faster, better, cheaper, more innovative, whatever, then you can build yourself so much flexibility when it comes to everything else. Go to market. You can mess up hiring your VP sales 10 times over and still build a massive company. You can mess up your customer service. If you've got a product that has huge product market fit and is genuinely better than this, you really are on your way. So finding founders that are product obsessed is massive for us. I think the other sort of threads that tend to tie them together is you tend to have a real sense of focus and urgency. I think that's definitely common in all of the founders that we've backed that have gone on to build really big, successful global companies. And there's also, you know, I think it's this underrated quality in great founders, which is empathy. I think if your superpower is empathy, it helps on so many layers when it comes to building a great companies. And you know, selfishly for us, you know, typically founders who have great empathy aren't assholes. They're good people generally, and they're great to work with. So it makes our job a lot more enjoyable. But I think more important to that, it also means that, you know, you are able to build teams around you that can believe in your vision and that can buy into your leadership. If you've got fantastic empathy, you can really help build that team. It's much, much easier. It comes much more naturally building great teams and being a fantastic leader. And then going back to the piece around being product obsessed, if you have deep and natural empathy for your customers, then you're naturally in a much better position to build a product that genuinely solves their problem better than everywhere else in the market. So I think you know, when we really try and find companies and find great founders, that is a big thing that we look for.
Sure. So taking the example of someone, obviously I assume it's a rare case when you have to wait for a company to incorporate before you sort of before you give them the actual term sheet. But
it's not. To be fair, it's actually not that rare. I mean, quite often we're in the process of helping great founders formulate their ideas and sort of refine these ideas, and they come to us and say, I've got this fantastic background, I've got these amazing insights into, market X, Y, Z. How do I think about sort of the business element? How do I think about team building? How do I think about that sort of stuff? And really, the ones I love doing are where you've got that raw materials and a founder is coming to you and you can help them sort of formulate and refine those ideas over, a course of a few months. And then, suddenly they pop out this other, they've got a great vision, it's all sort of tight, and then you're ready to go. And it's great. It's sort of you're part of the earliest creation.
Yeah, which is a really big part of that feedback thing of, I feel that there's a lot of founders that would approach talking to a VC about something like this if I need to have something that's polished and finished to be able to present to them because I want them to look at it from an investment lens.
That's bullshit, yeah.
Yeah, versus essentially from what I'm reading from what you're saying is, you want to help them not co-create it, but essentially help them join the dots of the different things that they're bringing to you and help them refine that process. So
I think that's fundamentally important. And I think learning how you and your investor will work together as part of that process is incredibly important, both for you as a founder and for the investor. For us, getting that process of, being able to sit down and do a whiteboarding session, really understand how they think about things, figuring out what it's like when you disagree. I mean, as part of this process, we often sort of pick fights for no reason other than to understand how it operates when we sort of don't see eye to eye on something. And if someone can sort of take that on face value and understand that this is all about trying to find the truth and be radically open-minded about getting to the truth, that's a great sign for us. So we do test that for sure as part of this process. But I think it's often a bit of a red flag for us when a founder decides that they want to have everything completely polished before they go and tell investors about it. Not because of the investment process, more because of that worries us about how they're thinking about product iteration with their product, right? If you wait until everything is ready to go and it's perfect and it's much more than an MVP and then go out and get customer feedback, you're lost. Someone else is in your lunch already. You need to be iterating in this process as much as you can. And sometimes, sort of counterintuitively, the more polish that you put into a prototype or a pitch deck or things like that, actually wounds up being unhelpful because if you go and talk to some of your customers and you've got a fully fledged, perfect looking MVP with it's absolutely pixel perfect, and you ask them what they think about it, they're much more likely to give you the sort of the blow-off positive response. Oh yeah, that sounds great. Whereas if it actually looks like you literally did it on the back of an envelope, then you're going to get the real feedback from your customers, and you're going to be able to have that process of iteration and product development and needs finding much better.
In one of the articles that I think you were featured in as well, it was I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was the need for speed. So taking something from not just like concept to an MVP to something that's in market, the need for speed is really important. I think that's the biggest advantage for startups as well. And I guess similar to that point, if you're waiting for things to be perfect before you show anyone, you're just slowing yourself down.
Yeah.
And often whatever first version you put in front of customers or investors isn't going to be perfect.
100%. Speed is your absolute secret weapon as a startup. In fact, it's really the only thing you've got, and it should be your key KPI. Time to product market fit, time to scale, time to team building. These are all like critical factors for you as a startup. I mean, people often talk about your competition being the incumbents, and oftentimes that's true, right? And really it's a race between the startup who may have fantastic innovation but has no distribution and no go-to-market yet. It's a race that's on between that startup. How quickly can that startup build distribution and go-to-market versus how quickly can the incumbent build innovation and technology? And I think that race is accelerating now. You see a lot of the big tech companies now, they are very good at innovation and they've already got the distribution. So to be able to beat them, you have to execute incredibly quickly. So going back to the piece that we talked about around what we look for in founders, having that sense of urgency is absolutely critical, I think. And you really can see that the best founders in our portfolio, people like Manish at DGraph, is constantly building out the product, and it's incredible the speed at which he comes, and he hits every deadline that he sets out to do, bar none. It's incredible. Natalie at HyperAnna, every time we see her, she's added another 20 people to the team. It's incredible, but she's constantly in the urgency of execution. Now you have to be a little bit careful with that, right? Because I think people often confuse urgency with workload, and I think and we should definitely talk about this as well at some point. But the burnout is a genuine risk, and I think that you really have to be quite clever about how you build the culture around your team. Urgency is incredibly important, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're in the office 24 hours a day, right? You can be urgent and efficient, and you can be constantly moving the ball down the field for your startup without having to create a culture where everybody feels that they need to be in place all the time and not getting a break.
Absolutely, and it's not just the amount of time, but it's also what are you focusing on, and is that actually moving the needle? I've seen so many startups that spend an inordinate amount of time on little details that will make no impact when they haven't spoken to customers. Things like their logo or their name, or just various things that have zero impact.
Or building a sort of 90-page Word document investment memorandum, which just is bonkers. And I never saw that before coming back to Australia, but I see it a lot down here. It's crazy.
So in terms of that, for I guess for an early stage founder or for someone that that really excites you to meet with, what is it that they should be focusing on, and what is the cadence of speed?
I mean, the key KPI early on is how quickly can you get to product market fit, and you want to give yourself enough runway, and you want to give yourself enough shots on target to get that, because it's really hard to understand how long it's going to take. When we did an exercise the other day where we sort of mapped out all of our startup across the board, how long it took them to get to $1 million in annual revenue, and then how long it took them to get the ones that get from $1 million to 10 million. And there's very little correlation between the ones that can really quickly get to $1 million in revenues and then go on to get to the 10 million in revenues, versus the ones who take their time to get to $1 million and then also get to the 10 million. And I think the reason for that is finding product market fit just takes as long as it takes, right? There are ways that you can speed up that process, and talking to your customers and understanding fully what they mean and getting in front of them as much as possible is obviously the number one, and really just what you should be spending the vast majority of your time. Rather than building code, go out and ask them and figure them out and really get to that level of customer obsession that enables you to become product obsessed, which enables you to build the greatest product in market, which then you can go off and scale. And then it becomes a question of execution and hiring the right people around you and finding a VP marketing and finding a VP customer success. And that's more programmatic. There's more playbooks around that. But the part at the beginning, that is by definition idiosyncratic, because you're building something that is net new to the world.
Speaking of obsession, and you just touched on sort of mental health as well, I think founders are generally obsessed with their idea.
Yep.
And it's very, as you mentioned, there's so many different things like, I need to work harder because we're not quite at the point that I want us to be, or we just need to move faster and those types of things. How do you approach mental health for the portfolio companies, or what are your sort of recommendations for founders to improve their mental health when it comes to business?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably one of the biggest issues facing Startup Oz out there, right? Founder mental health. And it's something that we don't talk about nearly enough. And, I try to bang the drum about this a little bit because, there's studies out there. There's US studies that say that 50% of founders will at some point suffer mental health struggles. 30% will go through bouts of depression. And you compare that to the sort of mainstream population in Australia, the incidence is about half of that. And if that's not, the most terrifying statistic in Startup Oz, I don't know what is. And it's something that's very dear to my heart, because it's something I've certainly suffered from time to time, both as an operator and as a VC. And it sort of makes sense, right? There's an incredible amount of pressure on founders and early stage startup employees. There's pressure from your employees. There's pressure from your friends and family who don't really understand why the fuck you're doing this. It seems absolutely insane to them. There's pressure from your customers getting things out constantly, fielding support tickets. There's pressure from, unfortunately, sometimes pressure from investors. And then on top of all that, you pile on this sort of additional sort of bullshit pressure that comes from the startup ecosystem, which is, you constantly have to be talking about how you're crushing it and killing it and et cetera. And I hate that terminology because I think it does sort of put fuel to this fire. And I think that it becomes this real issue that founders feel that they can't talk about these issues for fear of people thinking they're for some reason less competent in their role as a founder, which is complete bullshit, right? Just sort of going through bouts of mental health issues means nothing in terms of you building your company. In fact, most of the best founders that we talked about are outliers in some dimension, with all the great things that come with being a complete outlier. Often obsession and mental health issues come along with that. So it's actually oftentimes part and parcel with being a fantastic founder. And so I feel that this is something we genuinely need to talk about. I think we did talk about it a little bit more in the UK and the US. I don't know if it's because we're sort of a more emerging ecosystem, or if it's this sort of, she'll be Apple's sort of approach that we take in Australia. But I do think we need to talk about it. And it's not just the founders should be talking about it, it's just us as investors as well. This is very much on our shoulders. The best investors shouldn't be piling more pressure on. That's my greatest fear, that us as investors will be in a situation where we're increasing the potential incidence of mental health by putting pressure on. We should be the pressure release valve. We should be the ones that our founders can come to and talk about these issues, and we can sort of take things off their plate, or run them through, put them in touch with people who have been in similar situations. We have a bank of people that we point out all of our founders to, clinical psychologists or people who have been through similar issues, just to try and help out. And we'll pick up the costs on that because it's such a fundamentally important issue for our founders. And purely based on statistics, there will be founders in our portfolio that are going through this right now, and some we know about, and we really try and help as much as we can, and others we might not, and that terrifies me. So I think it's on us to really talk about this as much as possible and try and normalize the fact that this is a big issue, but it doesn't have to be a big issue.
Absolutely. I've gone through it myself several times, and I think one of the biggest things is founders are generally, by nature, it's a very isolating role.
Yeah.
Even if you have, a large team and all of those things, you're still the founder, and you are not the cause of, but all of the pressure to make things work, for right or wrong, is generally on the founder, and they take it upon themselves. The success of the business in any way, or the failure of the business, is completely on them.
Yeah.
And I think again, because it's so isolating that you can. I remember for me, it was thinking when Sage Label, we kind of shut that down, that I was the worst founder in the world. How did I think I could do this, and all of those different things. But I think one of the biggest things for me from talking through the podcast is, it's not just founders that have failed, but also founders that are successful in raising funding, and from the outside looking in, that they're doing really well. Everyone goes through it, and everyone goes through those moments. So it's like, how do we open up those conversations and just say that it's okay to have these, to have moments of doubt, and to be able to talk about this with other people that are going through similar things.
100%, and literally everybody does. And I think this is for founders out there that are going through these situations now, please do reach out, because I have conversations with founders about this sort of thing all the time. And as I said, we have a whole bunch of people who have been through this, and that are happy to talk about how they use coping mechanisms and got through it. And we also know a lot of clinical psychologists that spend a lot of time with founders that can really help in situations like this as well. So please do reach out. Find me on Twitter or wherever else, because I'm very happy to talk about these things.
Sure. And again, you touched on kind of the slight sort of cultural differences between what's happening here and the UK and the US as well. So obviously, with Excel, you were based in the UK at their London office. Really curious to know, both from, I guess, an investment or generally as an ecosystem perspective, what are the main differences that you have seen or experienced between Australia and the more sort of international markets? Yeah.
So I think the greatest thing about working at a big international fund like Excel was that we got to see founders from just about everywhere, right? We were very active here in Australia. In fact, we did, going back to the 5 years or so, we did some of the bigger growth deals to come out of the market, like Atlassian and Campaign Monitor and Invoice to Go and Xero over in New Zealand. So we saw a lot of Aussie and Kiwi founders at sort of that growth stage, as well as, I used to work with founders in the UK, in Spain. I used to cover Israel for Excel, so I was there a week a month. And so you'd see these sort of nuances between how founders typically use their own cultural backgrounds and approached the startup game. And I used to get asked this question a bunch about UK founders, difference in UK founders and US founders. And I think there's, to go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, like the great founders, there's no stereotype. So it's really hard to generalize about any of this stuff, but I will anyway. I think pound for pound, if you took two startups, all else being equal, similar level of traction, similar levels of funding, whatever metric you want to measure them against, the same broad startup, a UK founder and a US founder. I think the US founder is typically going to be more confident in describing his startup, and they're going to be probably certainly less self-deprecating and generally better at describing a vision for world domination, an ambitious vision for world domination, which I think is really important when it comes to storytelling, both to your internal employees and building a team as well as investors. And I think Australians sort of naturally fall somewhere in between, the UK and the US. I think possibly skew a little bit towards the UK, and I think it's important to sort of put yourself in those shoes and think, all right, how would I describe this if I was an American? And sometimes, there's a fine line between confidence and overconfidence where it just becomes hand waving, right? And people can see through that. So you have to genuinely be believing in it. But I think the way to do that is, you should shift your focus a little bit. I think I find that in America, founders there's two modes of operating, right? There's your natural mode can be to focus on the risks, or it can be to focus on the opportunities. And I think naturally American founders will be more focused around the opportunity. They'll be cognizant of the risks and they'll constantly try and de-risk the risk, but Australians start the modus operandi often with focusing on the risks. And so I see, we constantly talk to founders who come in and they talk to us about their 18-month, 2-year plan to build revenues and de-risk the startup. And that's fine. You have to really be focused on that. But if it is at the expense of focusing on the broader opportunity, that's incredibly difficult. And we take those sort of big revenue estimates for 2-3 years out. We kind of throw them in the bin, right? Because startups just move so quickly, and it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen out in 2 years. There's almost no point. One of our venture partners, Anil Sabharwal, who works at Google as a VP, has just moved out to Sydney. He always talks about this concept of thinking about plans in two ways. You've got your 6-month plan or your 100-day plan. What am I going to execute on the next few months? And then you've got your 5-year plan. One is the day-to-day in the trenches. How am I going to, push the ball down the field today? And another is, where is the world going to be in 5 years, and how does my vision and my ambition fit into that? And that's what we love to see. So I think if you can focus on that, you're going to be much better at describing that really ambitious long-term play. Because at the end of the day, startups are fucking hard, right? Like if you're going to do a startup, you're going to have so many ups and downs. You may as well go after something that is ambitious and can really have a global impact versus something that is just as tough but can't have nearly as much of an impact.
Sure. So you mentioned, I guess one of the main differences being that US founders are generally more, more upfront with their vision and more comfortable in kind of sharing that. For people that potentially that doesn't come as naturally to. Is there a way that they can get better at that sort of storytelling piece and being able to sort of translate that?
Yeah, practice. I mean, startups are all about storytelling. It's basically sales and storytelling. It's kind of the same thing, right? And I think the best advice I've ever had from one of a guy called Kirk Bowman, who was on the board of Atlassian for a long time. He is just a fantastic salesman. He said, if you're approaching sales conversations, talk to them like they're your brother or sister. You take all the sort of the pressure, all the sort of high pressure sales part out of it, and just talk to them like you're enthusiastic and you're generally trying to help solve a problem. And I think the same thing is around storytelling. You take the pitch part out of the pitch and just talk about something like you're really excited about it, and then it will shine through. You'll be a much, much, much better storyteller if you're just having a genuine conversation and trying to connect with someone on a personal level versus putting these sort of us and them walls up in between.
Yeah, I think one of the things that often gets overlooked is that every founder, sales is a core skill that they need to have, because you're not just selling to potential customers, but you're selling to investors, you're selling to hires, you're selling to teams, you're selling the vision of everything. You really need to understand how it is that you're that you're trying to translate your vision and why you're excited about that business to other people to try and bring them along to the journey as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably the number one skill that a CEO really has to master. I think this, and it's slightly different to sort of the professional sales skill set. It really is more about the storytelling part, telling to investors, employees, etc. It's bringing people along for the journey. Whereas, there is also a sort of distinct skill set around sales, particularly enterprise sales. Like that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think Australia, for one reason or another, has tended to shy away from these sort of heavily enterprise sales-driven models for most of the companies, and I can understand why. I mean, I think there's these phenomenal role models out there like Atlassian and Canva who have been able to build big businesses with very little, no outbound, no field sales teams, no sort of enterprise sales, and it makes sense. And I think if you're building a company out of Australia and you have the option of being able to sell to your customers from Australia without ever needing to step foot over in the US or build presence out there, it makes logical sense, right? But I think at the same time, trying to sort of shoehorn a go-to-market model over something that it just doesn't fit with is very problematic. And I think founders are naturally hesitant to, founders and many investors are hesitant to look at anything that actually requires salespeople. In actual fact, if you're selling something and it's got a high average contract value, you're selling into enterprises where you have to get multiple stakeholders to buy in, or it's a sort of a technical sale, then it's complicated stuff. And actually having a professional set of sales skill sets within your company can be game changing.
So on that, again, how should founders approach the enterprise sales process, and when does it make sense for them to hire, say, a VP of sales or someone with more experience or someone to kind of take over that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the product that you're selling and how the customer buys. Basically, you have to really understand how the customer buys, what the average contract value is, etc., and that will really dictate what your sales model. If you're selling something over 50K in ACV, or you have to get multiple buyers, then it's really hard to do that without a field sales force, people who can really understand how enterprises work, how they operate, and how to build consensus amongst enterprise procurement teams of buyers, etc. And that's really complicated. That's a professional skill set. So it comes down to the product. So, we've got companies in our portfolio like HyperAnna, for example, that is just very, very good at this. They can slide in, and the product is phenomenal, so that gets them in the door. But then you also have to do the operations. You have to be sitting with the office with them and get to know the CFO as well as the CTO as well as the procurement team and build consensus around that. And that really is a case of oftentimes having people on the ground. Now, if you're selling, like most of these companies, into the US as your biggest software market, which still for the moment, for the most part in enterprise software is the case, then building a US presence is important. I mean, you can, taking the Israeli model, which is, keep your R&D and local and really sort of take advantage of the great deep bench of great tech talent we have in Australia, but in building a go-to-market team in the US, often that starts to make sense. And sometimes increasingly we see that with enterprise software companies who are moving over at a very early stage, like Manish at dGraph, who's just moved back to the US, who we've been lucky enough to be involved with them back. Whereas HyperAnna now are selling largely into Asia, but it does require people to actually be out there and in the game locally, and that's tough, right? Because then you've got to be thinking about how do I set up international offices, how do I hire VP sales, and that's I think of all the hires, perhaps outside of building your co-founder team, finding an international head of sales or VP sales is probably the hardest job you'll ever go through, particularly in the US. And we used to do this for all of our companies in Europe at Excel, where we'd have Spanish companies who would go across and try to hire a VP sales in the US, and it was a fucking nightmare because they'd come back and every VP sales candidate they spoke to seemed fantastic, and it was because they're American and they were salespeople. They really know how to sell themselves, and so you probably are going to screw that up 2 or 3 times over. So that's where you really can rely on your investors, I think, and help them get up this learning curve.
Sure. So on that, how would you recommend approaching hiring a VP of sales? So what are the core core things that you should look for? What obviously every process is different, but what are the main markers that you would look for or recommend for a company that was in your portfolio that was looking to hire their first VP of sales?
Well, for a start, don't hire a VP of sales thinking they're going to be they're going to be closing all your accounts. You should be building up your own sales playbook before you even start thinking about hiring a VP sales. And oftentimes that means hiring some individual contributors up front. Hire 2 sales reps into a new region to begin with. And they don't have to be super senior either, just to try and get up the sales learning curve. Once you've and the reason hire a couple is because you don't want a false positive. You don't want to hire some fantastic gun salesman and realize later on that they were just a complete outlier and that the rest of the team can't sell it. And likewise, you don't want to hire someone who's a complete dunce and realize that you probably could have gone and scaled the team. So I would have those people in place and then bring on a VP sales once those sales reps are sort of washing their own face. Once they've understood enough of the sales process that they can cover their own salaries at least in the sales that they bring in. And then you want to bring on a VP sales who is able to do 2 things. Who's able to come in and sort of and help play close on your really important contracts, but also someone who can come in and build that playbook and really sort of do sales management and understand how to do incentive plans, understand how to do regional splits between your sales team. All of that stuff is core skill sets that you can only really learn at a high growth startup. Making sure you're checking all your references and getting them sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many people actually run through and do all of that. And don't be blown away by big names on CVs. If you're a early stage startup that's just found product market fit and is trying to scale the sales team, it's easy to get all starry-eyed when someone from a 15-year expert salesman from Oracle comes in the door and want to hire them. But ultimately, they're probably not the person that you need. You need someone that can survive in the cut and thrust of a company that's still really getting on its feet and understanding what the customer needs are, rather than just putting a playbook to work.
Absolutely. So obviously that kind of leads on to, there's a lot of talk, especially in Australia, about how we, how do we get started? So how do we launch a startup? How do we sort of go to market? I guess some of the things that are less talked about are what are some of the real challenges around scaling companies successfully globally? And, we just kind of touched on that in terms of hiring someone like a VP of sales. What are some of the common challenges that you've seen through your experience around scaling startups that are probably less talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the question for the Australian startup ecosystem in particular, because we've seen an explosion in early stage activity in Australia, right? There are more demo days and pitch nights and accelerators and incubators now than there's ever been before. And we did we crowdsourced a document the other day where we asked everybody who's an angel investor or a VC or an incubator or an accelerator to put your name on, just so we can understand sort of who's out there doing early stage activity in Australia. And within about 36 hours, I think we had hundreds and hundreds of angels and a bit over 100 incubators and accelerators. And so there is a ton of stuff going on in the very early stage. I don't think the challenge is starting up in Australia anymore. The challenge really becomes shifted into scaling up in Australia. And people sort of often ask, what are the key differences in the ecosystem here and in the US? I don't think the West Coast is not a special place because of the number of startups that get started. There's startups that get started in anywhere, Berlin, London, Melbourne, Sydney. There's startups everywhere. I think the reason that makes Silicon Valley special is because it's still the greatest place on earth, in my opinion, to scale a startup. It has the networks that you really need to accelerate your growth from product market fit through to true scale. And I think that's networks of capital, it's networks of customers, it's networks of talent. It's still the greatest place. And I think we see that from the numbers of if you look at the graduation curves of startups in Australia, the ones that start raising seed money and then go on to raise Series A and B and beyond, there's a big drop off compared to certainly the US and even in Europe. I mean, I think it drops by about half the proportion of companies that raise seed that go on to raise Series A, and then by Series C, it's about a third of what we see in the US. So it's still a challenge, and I think the predictive value of getting a startup off the ground and up and running product market fit, getting to your first $1 million of revenue, is much less now than it was of 5 years ago. Much less predictive of whether or not you're going to be able to build a big scaled business in Australia because it's tough. It's tough because it's hard to find the right talent. It's tough because the common criticism has always been it's tough to find the right capital, and I think that's a fair criticism. I certainly think when we at Excel were investing in Australia in companies like Atlassian and Campaign Monitor, there wasn't a lot of local money floating around. I think that has changed phenomenally in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. There's $3 billion or so poured into VC funds in the last couple of years alone. And then you've also got a lot of the US funds that we co-invest with, like Excel and Sequoia and USV. They're coming in down and are very willing to write checks in Australia now. So I think that part of the equation is starting to get fixed, but it's still tough to find the right talent, finding a VP marketing, a VP sales, finding a VP customer success. So many companies that we see that have great founders and are able to sort of rocket to through that initial phase and get to product market fit, a couple of million in revenues, and then hit the wall. It's because they weren't able to find that fantastic layer of VP support around them. And that's tough. That's tough to do in Australia still. And if we keep fucking with the visa situation, it's going to be even harder to do.
So James, what is it specifically that gets you excited when it comes to investment?
Well, I think our general approach at Airtree is sort of a mixture of being very specific and thematically driven, and we used to call it at XO, we used to call it the prepared mind initiatives, where we go very deep on an area that we think is going to be a massive game-changing shift in the tech economy over the next few years. And then a mixture of that and sort of opportunistically meeting founders through networks and out in person in the events and things like that, and being introduced from our other founders. And I think we have to keep an open mind. But we all have our pet areas that we really love, and I think some of the stuff that really excites me at the moment is some of the really unsexy infrastructure part of technology. And by that I mean, if we fast forward 5 or 10 or 15 years into a world where there's 100 billion IoT devices are connected, and we're all streaming broadband directly from satellites, and everyone's living in a world of 360-degree VR, 4K headsets. The amount of hardware and software infrastructure that has to sit and come to market to be below that application layer is incredible. And we are seeing huge platform shifts, both on the hardware layer and the software layer. And on the hardware, we're seeing over the long term, incredible advances in quantum computing. We're almost at the point where we've got to quantum supremacy, where you can demonstrate that a quantum computer can perform a task better and faster than a traditional computer. And we're a long way off having useful quantum computers, obviously. But there's also a lot of work being done trying to eke out the last bit of performance out of traditional computing architectures, things like optical GPUs and reversible computing, that is really trying to just get the last bit before Moore's law completely collapses. And then on the software side, there's a bunch of really exciting but unsexy stuff going on. So, I spent a lot of time looking at the world of containers and microservices and edge computing and serverless computing. There's sort of this atomization of the computing infrastructure that we're seeing going on at the moment. And there's going to be, several tens of billions of dollars worth of companies that are built in this infrastructure layer to over the next couple of years, I think. And on developer tooling as well. I mean, that's another big part of this. Australia's got a really proud history of great developer tooling companies, from Atlassian all the way down to folk like dgraph who are working in the space. And really, we're in a world now where software is not just eating the world; it's also eating software itself. Code is code is becoming just another form of data, and the inevitable conclusion there is that AI starts to write code itself as well. Other areas, cybersecurity is a huge area for me. It's incredibly exciting. It's probably the number one technology consideration for boards across the country and across the globe at the moment. And when we talk about enterprise software companies, we're always considering how big is the budget for this, who owns the budget for, etc. Cybersecurity is one of these areas where there is literally no budget. Companies talk about having to buy for defense and depth, which basically is just code for buy fucking everything. And so there's no better place to be an enterprise software company than when you've really got unlimited budgets that the customers you're selling into. And then we spend a lot of time in AI across the board, and I feel like and I'm almost to the point where I'm sick of talking about this because it feels like such a buzzword. But unlike a lot of buzzwords out there, this is probably outside maybe of quantum computing, it's probably the fundamental platform shift that we will go through over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, I think. And when you've got companies, massive companies like Microsoft and Google renaming themselves as AI companies, you really do see that there's a massive shift here. And this is, we're a big focus on being able to use great smart AI to solve very distinct problems, and we've seen that in our companies like HyperAnna and Thematic and Fluorosat, who are doing just that. And for the most part, their customers don't give a shit if there's AI under the hood. In fact, they don't even really call it AI. It's only really called AI until it works, and then when it works, people just call it software. And so that's going to be obviously a big area of focus for us continuing.
How do you assess those opportunities? So those infrastructure players that are maybe sort of, a couple of years down the horizon, how do you I guess quantify the opportunity there from an investment perspective?
Yeah, I mean, if you genuinely believe that there's infrastructure that is required to build out the application layer from everything from IoT applications to consumer internet to VR, then the opportunities in the markets that these core fundamental infrastructure building blocks, both on the hardware and the software side, is immense, right? You very rarely run into market sizing complications. But then it comes down to timing. And more startups have died through to mistiming things than probably anything else. And so when we are looking at these core technologies, and we've done companies in core infrastructure around databases, around computing hardware, around satellite communications and optical communications, then the key question for us is how and when do you really start to get initial traction with some of these customers? And there will always be milestones that you can hit along the way. These things sound fantastic and they sound like it's only going to be applicable 5 to 10 years out. But if you can get initial sort of testing and product and be able to check those milestones off as you grow, then you're able to just make sure that you're keeping and tracking to expectations. And then, of course, the number one is challenge in all this is finding teams that are genuinely world-class. And there are, I'm completely convinced that great technical talent is sort of, universally distributed around the globe, and Australia's no different. We have phenomenal talent working in a bunch of different fields, and if you can sort of give them the belief and the ambition to go off and build genuine global category-defining companies, then magic can happen.
Just on the timing thing as well. How do you quantify, or how do you know? From an investment perspective, again, just infrastructure aside and just generally looking at investments, when do you know it's the right time for a particular solution that you're looking at from an investment perspective? And is that more of a gut feel? Is there a process that you apply to that decision-making process? Yeah,
you don't, right? I mean, we that's why we build real conviction around founders. And we build real conviction around founders, and we give them enough capital resources, support, to go off and figure it out. And if we came in and only gave them a year's runway to try and figure something out, of course you're never going to figure it out, because you just don't give yourself enough shots on target. Which is why we come in and we want to build real conviction that this is the right person. This person genuinely has enough of those sort of outlier qualities that we talked about to build a massive business here, and they have the ambition and the belief in themselves to do that, and then give them support, give them the resources, give them the opportunities to go off and spend 2 years working through these challenges and finding that the right product approach to it. And really, that's the only way that you can make these, because of course you can't time the market, right? There's no way. You can have a view on it. The view's going to change 10 times over. But if you've got someone who is naturally agile, incredibly talented, and has ambitious to stick with it, you will figure it out.
Yeah, I guess sort of final question for me as well. You've had a lot of experience overseas. I think you mentioned 15 years that you spent out of Australia and you've come back. What would you like to see in terms of the innovation agenda in Australia, or what would you like to see from a kind of ecosystem level to help us to the next stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the real reasons that I was keen to come back to Australia. Is I think there is a opportunity right now in Australia to sort of drag this economy kicking and screaming from a shitty old world focus of pulling crap out of the ground to something that's genuinely innovative and creative. And one of the things I really liked when I first started talking to Airtree is this is something that is hugely mission driven for Daniel and Craig and the whole team. And it's not just us either. It's all the big VCs in Australia feel the same way about playing a small but important role in being able to help that transition of Australia. And we can still fuck it up. Australia has, we really are at this sort of crossroads where we what we do in the next 5 or so years can really dictate how well we can compete globally in technology over the next 20 years. The startups are doing their bit. I like to think that as VCs we're trying to do our bit. The government is trying, but there's missteps all over the place, and everything from messing around with the visa situation to R&D tax credits. I mean, you can really mess a few things up there. Corporates, they have their role to play. It's ridiculous to me that the big corporates in Australia are only spending 1-2% on R&D, whereas the large ones in the US are somewhere around 8-9% on average in the Fortune 500. So we all have our bit to do, but we also have to bring Australia on the journey with us. Innovation has sort of become a bit of a dirty word, and I think there's good reason for that. People are generally scared about technology and the impact it can have on day-to-day lives, and it's really on us to make sure that this evolution in the economy is kind of an inclusive journey for mainstream Australia. It terrifies me to think that in 3-4 years' time, people might think of startups as a dirty word in the same way that some people think of innovation as a dirty word, and that's really it's really on us as investors, as founders, as everybody else, to make sure that this is an inclusive journey and that the benefits of a shift into technology do help the entire economy.
Fantastic, James. Thanks so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights. For anyone that wants to say hello, find out more, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Twitter, email, it's easy, james@airtree.vc. We are generally very open to anyone approaching us. Come find me at an event, at Meetup, wherever. I'm around.
Perfect. I'll make sure I add those links to the show notes. James, once again, thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thanks for tuning in to the Startup Playbook podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll be back shortly with another episode, but in the meantime, don't forget to check out some of our other podcast interviews. Thanks for watching.